Welcome to Electric Evolution with Liz Allan. This podcast is about the journey to a more sustainable future in order for us to be able to do our bit to achieve net zero. I'll be discussing a variety of topics with experts in their field in order to educate and increase our knowledge of clean energy, electric vehicles and the electric vehicle infrastructure. So whether you're an individual wanting to make a difference at home, a small business or a corporate, this podcast is just for you. Hi everyone, so I wanted to start by saying to you this is a very we're recording this the week before it goes out because this is a really important conversation, and I grabbed Colin today and messaged him and said, can you come on and talk about the ZEV mandate? So I've got Colin Walker, who's the head of transport at the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. He's back for a second time. Colin, thank you ever so much for joining me today. It's just brilliant to see you again.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Now then,
let's talk ZEV mandate.
Yeah, let's talk about it. So this week, the government have released a number of changes to the ZEV mandate, and as I said to you just before we started talking, that my husband and I were talking just last night about the thread that you'd put on, I'm still calling it Twitter, I'm sorry, on Twitter, and I had a look at it today and I was like, I've got to get Colin on because I need to understand it, everybody needs to understand it, and we need to know whether the headlines that are out in the, that come out in the press this week, are they accurate? Colin, can you just start off by just talking a little bit about what the ZEV mandate is for those? I know there's going to be lots of people listening who do know about it, but just what is it and what's it now turned into?
Well, this could go on for a while, so I'll try to keep it brief. The ZEV mandate, the Zero-Emission Vehicle mandate, it was a regulation introduced by the previous government, but has continued under this government. It is essentially a series of targets for the number of EVs that a manufacturer has to sell, and it's by proportion. So the mandate came into effect last year, and in the first year of the mandate, 2024, manufacturers had to ensure that 22% of the cars that they sold were electric, and that's gone up to 28% this year, goes up to 33% this year, goes up year on year until it gets to 80% in 2030, and then year on year until it gets to 100% in 2035, i.e. by 2035, manufacturers won't be able to sell anything other than zero-emission vehicles.
And that is new vehicles only, isn't it? It's not.
Yeah, new vehicles only. Very important. Lots of people in the press misrepresent that. Yeah. Second-hand vehicles, 80% of us buy our cars on the second-hand market. There are no restrictions on second-hand petrol and diesel cars. People will be exchanging them and buying them on the second-hand market well into the 2030s, probably even the 2040s. Yeah. It's just new vehicles. Pretty much groundbreaking piece of regulation. Not many other places in the world have done it. California has done it, and a few other states follow them. The EU is trying to introduce its own version. China has some sales targets. But a lot of eyes are on the UK for doing this because it's really important, because our single most emitting sector for CO2 is not the power how we generate our power. People always seem to assume it's that. It's transport. It's how we move people and things. It is the single biggest sector. I think it's about 24% of our CO2 emissions come from transport. And within that, well over half are cars. Yeah. Well over half are cars. Mm-hmm. So if we are to get to net zero, pretty much the most important thing we need to do is decarbonise our transport sector, in particular, decarbonise our cars. So the ZEV mandate, the government set this target to phase out the sale of all petrol and diesel cars by 2035. We can have another debate, which I'll leave for now, whether it's 2030, 2035, but 2035 is the one where no car can be sold with a petrol or diesel engine in it. The ZEV mandate is effectively the regulation by how we will get to that point.
Right.
And just one thing to say about it, it is working. I mean, the International Energy Agency recently came out and specifically singled out the ZEV mandate as being responsible for what they called the surge in EV sales that the UK had experienced in 2024. They went up 24% on 2023. And it means that the UK has actually overtaken Germany to become Europe's largest EV market. I think I saw somewhere that we're the third largest EV market in the world. I don't know that for sure, but what I do know for sure is we are Europe's largest electric vehicle market, and the ZEV mandate has done that, and it has one last thing. The reason why it's done that is it engenders competition. Manufacturers are competing with each other to sell EVs to hit their sales targets. And when you have that kind of competition, prices come down because people are cutting their prices to make their EVs more attractive, to encourage you to buy an EV from them than their competitor. And as a result, prices have gone down, EV sales have gone up. And our concern about what's happening is that if you weaken the mandates, you weaken that competition, prices can start going back up, sales can start going back down.
So we're kind of talking about this at the time when Donald Trump, I hate talking about them, I don't even like talking about that man's name, has introduced a variety of tariffs into a variety of countries, including the UK. And I have read a number of things, Colin, about the fact that kind of the mandate, the changes to the mandate are kind of hidden a little bit behind that. Do you agree?
Yes. That's the government's line, is that weakening a mandate is one of the measures they are taking to help support our car industry deal with the impact of the tariffs that are being placed. I think that's quite illogical. So mandates are, so the tariffs are being placed, and the US is a pretty important market for the cars that we export. I mean, 80% of the cars that we build in the UK get exported. Most go to the European Union, but second on the list is the US. I think just under 20% of the cars we export go to America. So this is a problem because particularly for companies like JLR that sell a lot of, generate an awful lot of revenue from the cars that they sell in the US, having a tariff whacked on their vehicles will make them less popular and sales are likely to come down. So they're worried. I think my personal opinion is that the government was keen to be seen to do something, and actually rushed forward its response to a consultation that had been open on the ZEV mandate way before the Trump tariffs were announced. Now, the reason why I say it's illogical is tariffs affect cars built in the UK that are exported abroad, specifically to America. The ZEV mandate is about cars sold in the UK. So the two things are actually completely unrelated. The ZEV mandate is solely about cars that we sell in the UK, most of which are imported, and the tariffs affect cars exported from the UK. So it's always felt a little disingenuous since this announcement was made to claim that playing around with the mandate will do anything to help car manufacturers deal with the problem that these tariffs present.
If we look back, and I know we're going to talk about the differences now and this weakening of ZEV, but in the run up to it, there's been a number of OEMs, so the vehicle manufacturers, am I right, have been lobbying the government, or certain vehicle manufacturers have been lobbying the government to actually change the mandate and actually weaken it, as it were. Now, I would assume, and you can tell me otherwise whether if I'm totally wrong, that the OEMs that are currently solely selling EVs like Polestar, it's not going to bother them at all. They want to just keep selling, don't they? But there are a number of OEMs that have been doing this. Am I right? Am I on the right lines here?
Yeah, you are. Now, I've learnt that there's often a very big difference between what manufacturers say in public and what they're saying to politicians behind the scenes. Okay. Often there is evidence to suggest they completely contradict themselves.
Oh, God.
They'll say one thing publicly and the opposite. But you're right. So in last year, the people who were being most vociferous in their criticism of the ZEV mandate were the likes of Stellantis and Ford, who were really struggling. However, others who were struggling, like Renault, didn't actually say that much. So there wasn't the closest pattern. But yes, there's clearly been a lot of lobbying on the government to weaken the mandate. Now, the argument is that manufacturers are really struggling to hit their sales targets, that the mandate places an extra burden on them in these difficult times with lots of global competition, rise of China, managing the transition to building EVs. They've been constantly pushing this narrative that they're really struggling, they're not hitting their targets. In reality, the car industry as a whole, in 2024, the first year of the mandate, met its obligations under the ZEV mandate. And in 2025, the second year, they are on track to hit their obligations under the ZEV mandate. And yet this narrative that the opposite is true, that they're really struggling, has been all pervasive. Most of our media reports it, repeats what the industry are telling them. Yes, we're really struggling. And it's clearly caught government's imagination, and the government is helping them meet a mandate that they're not really having any trouble meeting.
Oh, God.
That's the weird thing about it, is that you could understand these changes a little bit more if it was clear that the car industry was falling really short, but it isn't. Now, some manufacturers are underperforming, some are overperforming. BMW and Mercedes absolutely knocking it out of the park. Proof that legacy manufacturers can make the transition to building electric vehicles, that it's not too difficult. You know, BMW in 2025 so far, over 30% of the cars they have sold in the UK in 2025 are electric vehicles. Phenomenal. Proof that it can be done. Stellantis actually they actually even put a press release out in January proudly announcing that they had achieved the ZEV mandate regulation in 2024, despite having been incredibly critical of it for an awful lot of 2024. So there are certain manufacturers that are doing well. There are others that are doing really badly. Ford, terrible 2024. Probably down to the fact they managed to start 2024 with a grand total of one model of EV on sale.
Yeah.
The Mustang, which is not the most affordable one. You've now since got things like the Explorer coming online, the Capri, it's a Mondeo, going online. Actually, very interesting. I think the thing that's going to turn it around for a lot of these manufacturers is the small ones they produce. So even though Renault had a pretty poor 2024 in terms of EV sales, the 5, the Megane, the Scenic, all three of them getting rave reviews. Probably the 5 is really going to sell like hotcakes. They're probably going to be good. I think the new electric Puma that Ford are releasing could be their game changer, but let's wait and see. But anyway, the point being is some manufacturers doing well, some complain. But I also think it's true that even the manufacturers are doing well, they probably prefer selling petrol and diesel cars or hybrids. I think those cars probably generate them more profit per model because those are mature technologies. Electric is a new technology. The costs are often higher when you're adapting to a new technology and you're waiting for the economies of scale to kick in and for the technology to mature. Now, my argument has always been those are costs you need to bear in the short term to secure your long-term future, because the world is moving in one direction when it comes to EV sales, and that's up. Globally, sales of EVs in 2024 went up 25%. This is where we are going. China has got this. China has taken a strategic long-term view, and it is busy carving out its position in which it will dominate EV sales. Now, I don't understand why we in our country can't adopt a similar approach. It feels very short-term. It feels we need to maximize profit now. We can't afford to sell these cars. You're like, you won't be around in 10 years' time to sell any cars whatsoever if you don't focus, if you don't spend money in the short term to secure your long-term future and enjoy a slice of the market that you have carved out, that you can enjoy profitability from once the technology's matured and those economies of scale have kicked in. So yeah, that's where we are with the manufacturers. So it's just been constant narrative that we've always been trying to push back against with others in the sector, that we're really struggling, you need to help us, and you need to help us by doing one or two things. You either need to introduce more incentives to encourage more consumers to buy these cars, or you need to weaken the mandate. And it seems like they have been successful in achieving that second outcome.
So, who benefits from this then? I mean, if we look at what you're just saying, the fact that a number of the OEMs have kind of been able to say, look at us, aren't we brilliant? We've done the first year of, are they really going to, because a lot of this has been coming on for years, hasn't it? So their targets, these big OEMs are like moving the Titanic, aren't they, really? They have to kind of build all of this in to apply? Is it about 6 to 10 year cycles or something like that? Now, surely their profit model must have something, they can't just swing from one thing to another. Maybe I'm totally wrong.
No, I think it's an entirely reasonable point. And there's a part of me that thinks, will these changes actually result in significant downturn in EV sales? Because presumably a lot of these manufacturers have already planned out product launches and sales in 26, 27, 28, as you say, 6, 8, 10 years ago. So will the ability to suddenly massively decrease the number of EV sales and ramp up the number of hybrids they sell, is that actually going to bear out in reality? Because you can't just switch things on a dime and just go, oh, right, we'll just produce this new PHEV and sell that. So that is definitely a dynamic that might limit the impact of these changes to the mandate. But so it's hard to say for sure.
So if we go into these, if we talk about your thread and what you were putting, and I loved at the end you went, sorry, it's so long, but
I think it was my longest yet.
Can you just kind of break it down? And I know you said to me, didn't you? You're still trying to get into the detail, but if there's anybody who knows all of this stuff, it's gonna be you so far. We're only we're only partway through the week, aren't we? We're only on Wednesday, and the news came out on Monday, wasn't it? So
would you like me to run through the main changes?
If you can.
So I will. There are others that know the intricacies of some of these policy changes better than me.
Okay.
So like the guys at New Automotive, if you haven't had them on your podcast already, do. They really know the data in over detail. Ben Nelms, he's great. So if you really want to get into the detail here, he'd be a really good person to speak to in detail. But I hope I can give you a bit of a top line. But as I say, I think it's true of them as well. We're still trying to figure out what some of these changes will mean in practice. And my initial response when I saw them was, they're not great, they're not awful. But then I looked at it a bit more, because we saw a main press release and then this technical press release came out that went into more detail. And when I looked at that, I was like, oh no, this isn't great. So the changes that they are making, and I'll come back to what I think the impact of them will be. I'll just list them out at the moment. Firstly, it was always going to be the case that the sale of pure petrol and diesel cars would end in 2030, but that you would be able to sell hybrids with the ability to do a sufficient amount of electric-only driving. And what we mean there is plug-in hybrids. From 2030 to 2035. You're talking about a relatively small number of cars, actually, because by 2030, 80% of the cars you sell have to be zero emission. So that means in 2030, the remaining 20% of cars you sell would have to be PHEVs. And then by 2034, 96% of the cars you sell are electric. So you're talking about the remaining 4% of cars will be PHEVs. This new change will allow standard hybrid electric vehicles to be sold as well as PHEVs. So hybrids that you can't plug in to a wall, hybrids that get all the energy for their electric drivetrain from burning petrol or diesel in an internal combustion engine. I don't think this is as bad as it sounds, that specific regulation. I'll explain why now. Most people drive plug-in hybrids like standard hybrids. The evidence is that an awful lot of people don't bother plugging them in. So the European Commission analysed data from something like 600,000 cars, and where they found that, petrol cars and diesel cars typically burn 20% more fuel than their manufacturers claim. That's no surprise. We know what it's like. Those claimed MPGs and always seem a bit unrealistic. It's true of EV ranges as well, right? So, but the one exception to that was plug-in hybrids. Plug-in hybrids burn 350% more fuel than their manufacturers claim, because people aren't plugging them in. There is an assumption about the amount of driving that PHEVs will do using energy taken from a plug in the wall that is not playing out in practice. So actually, PHEVs don't deliver much more than standard hybrids in terms of CO2 reductions or money savings to people. So that was always a bit like that change. It was always something I never personally felt like we needed to die on a hill over, because I was like, I don't think it's going to make a huge amount of difference. So that's one big change. There will be there's some exception for small volume manufacturers. So what we're talking about is people that produce the ZEV mandate will not apply. So they won't have to worry, but I'll start again. They will be able to continue selling pure petrol and diesel cars right out until 2035. So they won't have to hybridize their fleet.
And that would be relating to which small that we're talking
Bentleys,
about.
McLarens.
Yeah.
You know, actually, if I look, Bentleys, McLarens. Anyone else? Who else? Yeah, probably Aston Martin. Probably affect them. So on the one hand, you're like, these are big polluting vehicles, but when you're looking at absolute numbers, it's a very small number of cars.
Okay.
So I don't think that's the change that's causing a huge amount of consternation across the sector. Whatever changes, they were decreasing the fines. So if you fail to meet the mandate, every credit you are short, you earn a credit by selling an EV. For every credit you fall short in hitting the ZEV mandate target, before you'd get fined £15,000, but now it's gone down to £12,000.
Okay.
But then the big changes are these ones. It's actually the changes to all the flexibilities in the regulation. An awful lot of flexibilities were built into the regulation to appease the manufacturers. Now, these flexibilities mean that fines are very much a thing of last resort. There's an underperforming manufacturer, there's an awful lot of things they can do to try to comply with the mandate before they have to contemplate paying fines to the government. In fact, in 2024, Transport and Environment did some really interesting analysis that found that not a single manufacturer in 2024 would have to pay a fine. All the flexibilities available in the regulation mean that even the worst performing manufacturers, like Suzuki, who did not sell a single EV in 2024, would not have to pay a fine.
Oh, God.
Because they can borrow credits from future allowances, and then they can buy credits from rival manufacturers. And because the overperforming manufacturers had generated a greater excess of credits than there was a shortfall of credits amongst the underperforming manufacturers, that's a buyer's market. So the price would probably be significantly less than the £15,000 fine. So that change in the fine thing isn't, I don't think, that big a deal. The ones that I think before we get to the ones that I think are really controversial, manufacturers will now be able to transfer credits between the car ZEV mandate and the van ZEV mandate.
Okay.
So if you are a manufacturer that is, I'm not sure if this is necessarily true of Stellantis, but we know Stellantis make a lot of vans. Say Stellantis are overperforming when it comes to their car ZEV mandate targets, and they build up an excess of credits. They will be able to transfer those credits over to help them hit their van targets if they are underperforming on their van targets. Again, that's a bit like, I don't think that's that. I think we saw that one coming, and I think there's some logic to it. It's not one for one. Like if you have one excess car credit, that's only worth 0.4 van credits. So you'd need 2.5 excess car credits and to turn that into one van credit. And conversely, the other way, one van credit is actually worth 2 car credits. So if you're one van credit above your level, you can transfer that over, and that will get you 2 new car credits to help you achieve your level if you're underperforming.
Oh my God. Okay.
So I know it's getting a bit techie, but that kind of gives you a sense.
No.
But then at those levels kind of make sense, because vans typically are much more polluting than a standard car. So it's again that change hasn't probably caused people too many concerns. It's the changes to the flexibilities that I mentioned before. So there are 2 big flexibilities that already existed in the regulation. So nothing new is being introduced, but the flexibilities that exist are being extended. One of them is borrowing. If you are struggling to hit your ZEV mandate target in any given year, between 2024 and 2026, you had the option to borrow credits from future years and then pay them back. And there's a bit of an interest, like 3.5% interest on any borrowing you did. So people who are really struggling, like Suzuki, or Renault, or JLR, would be able to go, right, we'll buy for good credits and we're confident we're going to massively ramp up EV sales in a couple of years' time, we'll pay all those credits back. That was one of the flexibilities. And the other one, it's quite hard to explain succinctly because I've tried time and time again to explain this on Twitter and explain this to journalists, and it never really lands. This year, 28% of your car sales have to be EVs. But here's the weird thing. You can earn credits to hit your EV sales target. It's not, sorry, I'll start again. It is not just the sale of EVs that can earn you the credits to hit your EV sales target.
Okay.
You can also earn credits if you reduce the CO2 emissions of your petrol and diesel fleet. So there's a separate regulation that actually awards people credits if they significantly bring down the average CO2 emissions of the petrol and the diesel cars that they sell. Right. And this flexibility allows you to transfer the credits you earn from doing that towards achieving your ZEV mandate target. Now, what this has resulted in is New Automotive doing some really interesting analysis in which they have worked out and each individual manufacturer's individual real ZEV mandate target. And what that means is that transfer mechanism, taking that into account and taking into account the extent by which different manufacturers are successfully lowering the CO2 emission petrol and diesel sales they do. We estimate that they would only need to sell this many EVs that, combined with those extra credits, will help them achieve their 28% target. So they worked out that what was it for? I think for this year, the headline target for EV sales is 28%, but that ability to earn credits from selling, from that CO2 transfer means the car industry as a whole only needs to hit around 23% EV sales to comply with the mandate.
Oh my God. So how, right. So I get what you're saying, but are we talking about the OEMs just making or being able to prove that their current petrol and diesel vehicles are more efficient and economic, etc., and their emissions are lower?
Something like that, but that is a classic example of something that New Automotive know a lot better than me. Probably get them. So yeah, like it is a bit strange. They're setting baselines for the overall fleet and all this kind of stuff, and it is a bit complex. But there is enough out there to allow us to work out how many EVs a manufacturer actually has to sell to hit the mandate, knowing that they will get extra credits from these CO2. Now, for example, Toyota. I wish I had the figures in front of me, but last year the nominal target was 22% EV sales. I think they had to get close to only half that. I swear it was like only 13-14% EV sales because they build so many hybrids, and because the hybrids are much lower CO2 emissions than a standard petrol car, they brought the fleet down a lot, which gives them an awful lot of extra credits they can carry over, meaning they have to sell fewer EVs. So that flexibility. So those are the two flexibilities: the borrowing one and the these non-ZEV credits, we call them. They're being extended. Now, before, those flexibilities were only going to exist in the first 3 years of the mandate, 24, 25, 26, and then they would stop. They're being extended to 2029.
Oh my God.
Now, and also, so firstly, you can now borrow credits for most of a decade, and you can carry on transferring non-EV credits earned from the petrol and diesel fleet. That can continue to help manufacturers out way up until 2029. So that means manufacturers theoretically will have to sell less EVs throughout the decade to comply with the ZEV mandate, which means fewer EVs on the road, which means more CO2 being emitted, which means more people being stuck driving dirtier and more expensive to run petrol cars for longer. So that's bad.
Yeah.
The reason it's more bad is that there's, again, I'll try to explain this succinctly, and I'm not sure I've done a particularly great job so far, is there is a cap on how many of those non-ZEV credits you can use to hit your EV target.
Right.
So in 2025, hang on, I'm just going to make sure I get this right because I need it in front of me. Right, yes. In 2025, only 45%, under the previous arrangements, only 45% of your EV sales target could be made up with credits earned from lowering your CO2 emissions of your petrol and diesel cars. That cap's been raised to 90%.
What?
So before, less than half of your EV sales target could be made up, but through credits earned through selling petrol and diesel cars with low CO2 emissions. Now it's 90%. So you can see now, and that will continue. So that goes down each year. But for example, in 2026, the cap was originally going to be lowered to 25%. Next year it will now be 80%. Then in 2027, when the flexibility was and the previous arrangements going to end, now 70% of your credits can be earned through non-EV sales. So you can now see that there's going to be a really quite strong incentive for car manufacturers to just carry on pushing, selling, particularly hybrids, rather than EVs, to hit their... This is the perverse thing. We have changed the mandate in a manner that shifts the incentive away from selling EVs to more emphasis on selling hybrid vehicles. So it slightly defies the point of the ZEV mandate, which is supposed to increase sales of zero-emission vehicles. And now we're just going to be selling lots of still, emitting vehicles. So this will almost certainly result, and this is the thing we're trying to get our heads around. We're trying to quantify exactly what this means. There is, I can send you a link and maybe you can drop it or share it with
I'll share it in the show notes,
where New Automotive have calculated kind of some stats about what this means. But I think, for example, I can give you a sense of like how bad it could get. Their calculations suggested that whereas before, in looking out to 2029, under all the original flexibilities, the minimum you had to hit 66% EV sales in 2029. Now, with all this extension of flexibilities, the car industry could theoretically only need to hit 33% EV sales to comply with the market. So theoretically, it might not happen like this, but they could sell half the number of EVs they originally needed to in 2029 and comply, which is a bad thing. And this has a number of knock-on effects. I've mentioned it will just keep people stuck driving more expensive cars for longer, petrol cars for longer. It will massively slow the growth of the second-hand market, which is where most of us buy our cars, and most of us will be able to afford to make the transition to electric driving.
Yeah.
The charging industry will be having absolute kittens about this.
Oh, I can imagine.
Because an awful lot of the rollout of our charging infrastructure is dependent on private capital. And investors the holy grail for investors is knowing what demand is likely to be. The great thing about the mandate is it gave investors supporting charging infrastructure companies a very clear sense about what future demand for their services and for their infrastructure is likely to be. Right? Brilliant. In this year, this number of EVs will be sold. And by this year, we could be able to say pretty confidently, this is how many EVs will be on the road. These flexibilities create huge uncertainty now. Like because we have not figured it out as a sector yet. We cannot say from these things what this means for EV sales. Now, the charging industry talk about how they have £6 billion ready to invest in our charging infrastructure, which is something we need. Our charging infrastructure is not perfect. We need to improve it. Perceptions of bad charging is definitely a barrier to people making the move to EVs. But also that's £6 billion that would go into our economy. And we have a stagnating economy and a government that is making economic growth its kind of like big mantra. So you could argue that these moves are actually quite anti-growth. They could actually hold back investment. And it's not just charging infrastructure, like people looking to invest it. EVs will be a big consumer of electricity in the future. So people looking to build wind farms and solar farms, are they confident that there'll be enough demand for the solar farms they want to build? Will this hold people back from investing in that kind of generating infrastructure? So it causes a lot of uncertainty there. Another big uncertainty I think it causes, which I'm sure industry would not agree with me on, as I mentioned before, the world is moving to EVs. Whether people like it or not, that is where we're going. Efforts to slow the pace of that transition may be successful, but they're not going to put it off. That's where we're going. EVs are the future. All of our major export markets are moving to EVs. If we get stuck building petrol and diesel cars, in a few years' time, we'll suddenly discover that the market for those cars has disappeared. And that is a recipe for factory closures and hundreds of thousands of job losses. The future of our car industry, back in the 70s, we did this before. We didn't adapt. We didn't move forward. Our car industry, we almost lost it. It rusted. It was a disaster. It has managed to recover. But we risk doing the same thing again if we don't invest in building the cars of tomorrow, because that is how we will secure its future. And one of the things that government can do to support the car industry in making that move is providing a stable and ambitious regulatory environment. And that's exactly what the ZEV mandate was. And I'm not sure if it is anymore.
No.
Because the government, in doing this, they have played around. They've started playing around with a regulation that's only been in effect for 16 months. And they have repeated the kind of flip-flopping we saw under Rishi Sunak when he started changing phase-out dates, which Auto Trader flagged as undermining consumer confidence. It held people back from making the transition to EVs. Yeah. So we're actually just repeating this, and we're just not providing the car industry with the stable regulatory environment they need as part of their efforts, as part of a package of efforts to help them make the shift to electric driving. We commissioned a report from CBI Economics to actually kind of test this hypothesis, because I've always felt an awful lot of people have gone, EVs are a threat to our car industry, and I've always felt that was counterintuitive. I was like, it's quite the opposite. A failure to embrace EVs is a threat to our car industry, but I got people who actually knew what they were talking about to kind of explore this. So we went to the CBI, and they found that our car industry generates about £47 billion in economic output and supports 550,000 full-time equivalent jobs. Quite a lot, and often in specific places like Ellesmere Port or South Derbyshire or Sunderland. And they found that if we make a rapid transition to EVs, that economic output could actually increase by 16 billion, and we could actually employ an extra 167,000 people. Conversely, worst case scenario, make no improvement in the proportion of cars that we build that are EVs. Our car industry, the economic output of a car industry could fall by 73%, or 34 billion, and over 400,000 jobs could be lost.
Oh, good God.
So what's that? 3/4 of the workforce? And one of the things they said in the report, one of the things they said that governments could do to help secure that positive outcome rather than negative outcome is provide a stable regulatory environment through measures like the ZEV mandate. And these changes undermine that. So in a nutshell is all my concerns.
Well, that's plenty. That's plenty. I suppose I was thinking in some ways, and I know you've not got a right lot of time left now, but it's a bit like lobbying's gone wrong. The lobbying from the OEMs they might have actually. Are they going to be rubbing their hands together, or are they going to be looking and thinking, "Oh my God,
they're
what
claiming
have we
it's not gone far enough, but they'll always want more. They would rather the ZEV mandate wasn't there at all, I'm sure. But it was welcomed as a step in the right direction by the SMMT. Yeah,
I was going to say that this is who are they? Are the theys? Are they the ones who haven't been putting the effort in the first place? I suppose.
I think the ones who've got the big influence over government policy, obviously the ones who employ large numbers of people here. Toyota in South Derbyshire, Stellantis in Ellesmere Port, Nissan in Sunderland, are obviously going to have an awful lot of influence because they employ a lot of people, and they employ a lot of people in areas that would be devastated by their departure. But when you talk about lobbying, and don't worry, I can push on a little bit past 5. The thing is, with these changes, we can also see a huge cliff edge approaching us. So these changes to the flexibilities have all been extended to 2029. And after 2029, they stop. And that means that suddenly all these flexibilities that have allowed car manufacturers to significantly reduce the proportion of EVs, they said, we'll just go. So I think, who is it? I think they pointed out that, is it in 2029? Like many firms might be, in 2029, firms might be able to get away with producing as low as 33% EVs to comply with the mandate, where the original target is, the headline target is 66%. But these flexibilities mean that they could be hitting as low as 33% to comply. In 2030, that ends. And in 2030, the target goes to 80%. And there will be no flexibilities in place to help you if you are struggling to meet 80%. Now, going from 33% sales in 2029 to 80% EV sales in 2030 is
madness,
implausible.
No.
And you know what's going to happen is that we'll get to that point and we'll have built up, all these problems would have backed up, the can has just been kicked down the road, and then boom, the car industry go, we don't have a chance in hell of making that jump. You need to help us. We need more flexibilities. We need to weaken the mandate further. So by not standing firm now, at a time when the car manufacturers are actually hitting, broadly getting there with the mandate, they're creating a situation where they'll get lobbied again. And this time the car industry will be quite justifiably going, we are not, it's going to hit this. And so the mandate could get weakened further. And also 2029, general election year.
Yeah.
So this could well become a real political hot potato.
Millstone as well.
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, to me, the common sense thing would be for the manufacturers who are on target to stick with the old ways. Do you know what I mean? Just go with what it said before, and then, because actually, if you're building up over the years and you were heading in that direction, you're doing a fairly decent job. Because, like you said, these big behemoth organizations, it's just hard for them to move around. So if that's what they were expecting, then
I heard anecdotally, because BMW, as I mentioned, are doing really well, and they did really well last year. They didn't just meet their ZEV mandate targets, they beat them. And I'm sure I heard someone say they'd spoken to someone from BMW go, why are you still pushing EV sales when you've already hit it? Because it's about market share. We don't just hit it, we want to carve out as much market share as possible, because that puts us in a stronger position against our competitors. So you're right, that's hopefully one of the mitigating factors to all this, is that manufacturers, they've already got their kind of product lineup and everything already done. They can't just change it like that. But they might look at this as an opportunity to kind of put more space between them and their flagging competitors. And come 2030, they'll be like, well, it might be able to hoover up the space.
And it's a bit like, I suppose you had the 2035 pushback, the 2030 to 2035 pushback under Rishi Sunak, didn't you? That kind of didn't do anything really to the manufacturers, because of the fact it was more public confidence, wasn't it?
Exactly that. The actual change was very minimal. It was a mountain out of a molehill stuff. It was always going to be the case that the sale of pure petrol and diesel cars was going to end in 2030, but hybrids, probably plug-in hybrids, would be allowed for another 5 years to 2035, at which point the sale of any car with a combustion engine in would end. All Rishi Sunak did was say, I'm going to get rid of that hybrid bit. So cars, you could continue selling petrol and diesel cars, pure petrol and diesel cars from 2030 to 2035. But because by 2030, under the original mandate, 80% of cars being sold with EV, you are literally talking about 20% of cars on sale, do they have a battery in or not? And given I'm quite skeptical about the meaningful impact that hybrids can have in terms of reducing CO2, they really offer marginal improvements over petrol and diesel cars when it comes to fuel efficiency compared to EVs. That it always felt like a bit of a mountain out of a molehill kind of thing. Our concern was that, as you say, it just it confused consumers. It told them they had more time than they have. That it took up the urgency off, and it just felt like it was going to just slow EV uptake. So when Labour came into power, they just originally went back to the phase-out dates as originally articulated by the Conservative Party before Sunak did his flip-flopping. But now, I have to say, I think the Labour Party in government are guilty of flip-flopping and creating regulatory uncertainty through these changes. And yeah, the car industry might be happy with what's happened, although they'll always, I think a lot of voices have been, a step in the right direction, but it's not enough. But the charging industry will not be happy with this. No. Green groups will not be happy with this, because it just keeps dirty, polluting petrol and diesel cars on the road for longer. Yeah. and slows the transition to electric vehicles, which is a bad thing.
So I'm going to ask you one final question then. So what are your thoughts? If you could give the government one piece of advice, what would that be?
It's hard now because you feel like this is done. It's kind of like this. They did a consultation on the changes that need to be. They're always going to come out with their response to the consultation. They've just brought forward that response to pitch it as an example of them doing something to help our car industry. I would say seriously, like you've introduced some changes. They're fine. They're not that impactful, but the extension of this ability, massively increasing the ability to hit your ZEV mandate targets through sales of petrol and diesel cars is the biggest problem. I think that's the thing that's going to really slow EV sales. It's going to slow the growth of the second-hand market. It's going to keep people stuck driving more expensive petrol cars in the midst of a cost of living crisis. It's going to incentivize manufacturers to carry on producing hybrids when they should be focused on making the transition to building EVs. That is what's critical for securing their future. And this feels like the protestations of short-term pain by the manufacturers probably needed to be not ignored, but qualified a little. And the government talks about producing an industrial strategy to help manufacturing, to help our car industry. Well, that needs to be looking to the long game. And these changes undermine, particularly those flexibilities. I think lower the chances of the UK having a successful, thriving car industry in 10, 15 years' time. So I'd love them to row back on that. If row back on anything, it's the extension of these flexibilities.
Yeah,
that would be.
Because we don't want a 2029 lobbying centre during, like you say, political uncertainty by then. I don't know. Well,
you can see that Reform leading in the polls or thereabouts, very much making their opposition to net zero a kind of centerpiece of their political strategy. Conservatives seem to be thinking more about how can they win Reform voters back rather than winning Labour and Lib Dem voters back. That means we've already seen Badenoch taking a more hostile approach to net zero and said some ill-informed things about EVs and potholes on the news yesterday.
Yeah.
You can see it going that way. You can see net zero is going to become more and more contentious, become more and more of a cultural issue. And I think EVs are going to become more and more a lightning rod for that. And so I think the Labour government have potentially created themselves quite a political problem.
Assuming they fight.
Yes, quite a lightning rod for their own back. Assuming that they don't call election until they have to in 2029.
It's going to be a watch this space, isn't it, really? I personally just hope that the OEMs and the kind of the manufacturers who are, like you say, who are leading the way already, just stick to that.
Crack on,
because they're going to, it's just going to drive a wedge between, you're going to see the ones that are going, right, China's doing this, so we need to kind of, right, we've got to follow them because we can see what they're doing. And actually whether the government
policies
are
just head in the sand.
Yeah, absolutely. So let them carry on putting their heads in the sand, those that want to do it. And then actually when we get to the point where more people, more OEMs, more organisations kind of recognise, let's just stick to what we'd agreed in the first place. And just, let's just go for it. But yeah, I think I just wanted you to join me today just to talk through some of this, because it just feels like this whole gloopy soup, like one of those really thick potato soups that you have in the winter. It just felt like with big lumps in it, and I know we've not, we've kind of not got to the bottom of every single bit, but just to have. I'm
sorry, it's hard to talk it through concisely.
Don't say sorry.
And we're still figuring it out, so I know it can be a bit wordy at times, but
no, Colin, honestly, everybody, I'm sure all of you watching and listening will recognise this man's knowledge, and this is why jumped on WhatsApp or on the blooming messaging apps, just to kind of get you on here, because actually, just from seeing that breakdown of the thread that you had, it just, you do know so much. And we'll see anything, I always say this, anything that's open to interpretation will be interpreted in a specific way. So over time, we will see all sorts of things kind of probably coming out from that. But now, you've given me, and I'm sure everybody watching and listening, that bit of clarity of thought and understanding. So I just really, really appreciate your time. Thank you ever so much. I said to you, everybody, when you're listening to this is coming out next week. I will have had an operation on my Achilles. So I'm going to be on crutches for like a fortnight. So I just said to Colin, can you just join me quickly? So thank you, Colin. Absolutely brilliant. I really, really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
So everybody, seriously, for those of you who wanted to know about ZEV, I'm sure you've got that level of clarity. Please share it, and we'll be putting posts on LinkedIn and etc. So share it with as many people as you can and help everybody understand ZEV a little bit more. And again, for you all watching and listening, I just want to say thank you, and I'll be hopping out next week. See you later. Bye. Thank you for watching Electric Evolution. I really love bringing you these weekly conversations about sustainability, renewables, and building a cleaner future together. If you're passionate about positive change, please like, subscribe, and share with others who also care about these topics. You can also download our white paper, Plugging into the Future, at fullcircleci.co.uk and join the discussion on improving sustainable transport, or email me at liz@fullcircleci.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye.